The first picture came in a little after 5 in the morning, and for about 10 seconds, I thought I was looking at a normal dog bite. The dog was a black shepherd mix. Big animal. Gray around the muzzle. Somebody had taken the picture through the glass door of a laundry room. The dog was on the other side, standing in the kitchen with its front legs stiff and its head low. There was blood on the tile near a chair, but not much. What caught me was the door. The lower half of it was scratched white from the dog hitting it over and over. The woman who sent the picture wrote that the dog had bitten her husband, chased her into the laundry room, and was now slamming itself into the door every time the washing machine changed cycles. I ran a small site that tracked animal attacks, shelter closures, loose dog calls, and veterinary warnings around the upper Midwest. Most mornings were boring. Coyotes near a school, somebody's husky killing chickens, a raccoon under a porch. I kept a police scanner on because animal control traffic often showed up there before any city department posted about it. I also had a little radio set up for emergency updates when storms knocked out phones. None of that made me a doctor, and I never pretended it did. I knew enough from years around shelters to know when an animal was scared, when it was defensive, and when something about the story did not fit. A woman gave me her address in a suburb west of Minneapolis. I told her to stay behind the solid door, keep her husband away from the dog, and call emergency services if she had not already. She said she had. Then she added one detail that made me stop typing. The dog had been asleep in the bedroom less than an hour earlier. Her husband got up to use the bathroom. The dog woke, followed him down the hall, and bit him in the calf without growling. No food, no stranger at the door, no fight between animals, no obvious trigger. The husband kicked free and ran. The dog did not stay on him. It turned and began attacking anything that made noise. A few minutes later, I heard the call on the scanner. The dispatcher said possible aggressive dog, 1 injured adult male, 1 adult female barricaded in another room. Then the responding officer said the animal was striking the inside of a glass patio door. He asked if animal control was coming. The answer was that the overnight unit had another call already. Another aggressive dog, different suburb. I wrote both locations down on paper because I had learned not to trust memory when calls started stacking. At 5:22, an email came from a warehouse worker near St. Paul. He had found 3 bats on the concrete floor inside a loading building. 2 were dead. 1 was crawling in circles and snapping when anyone came close. He had thrown a plastic tote over it and wanted to know whether he should call the city or a wildlife rescue. He attached a short video. The bat kept pushing its face against the side of the tote. Every time a forklift alarm sounded in the background, it became more active. It did not try to hide from the light. That was wrong enough that I forwarded the message to a veterinarian I knew and told the worker not to touch any of the bats. At 5:40, the veterinarian called me instead of replying. His name was Evan Kroll. He worked overnight and early mornings at a 24-hour clinic east of the city. He sounded tired and irritated, which was normal for him. He asked where the bats were. I told him. He went quiet, then said they had admitted a cat before dawn that had attacked 2 technicians and tried to bite through a kennel door. The cat had no vaccination records. It had been brought in because the owner said it had spent the night throwing itself at windows whenever trucks passed outside. I asked whether he thought rabies. He said maybe, but the behavior was odd. Rabid animals could be aggressive, disoriented, unusually tame, or paralyzed. Nothing about one strange cat made a new disease. What bothered him was that another clinic across town had called asking if he could take a dog they could not safely restrain. That dog had bitten its owner, and then bitten through the soft part of a catch-pole handle. He told me not to post anything yet. I agreed. 2 dogs, 1 cat, 3 bats. It was not a pattern. Not yet. I posted a short notice telling people in the metro area not to handle sick bats and to contact local authorities after unexplained animal bites. I did not mention rabies in the headline. That was deliberate. The word alone could make people do stupid things. I had seen neighbors poison healthy raccoons after a single confirmed case years before. I had seen somebody shoot a fox in a school parking lot because it walked out during daylight. Fear made people simplify things. A dangerous animal became every animal. A disease became everyone who might have touched one. By 6:15, the first dog was dead. The officer on scene reported that the animal had broken through the patio door, cut itself badly, and kept charging until police shot it. The injured husband went to an emergency department for stitches. The second dog had been captured alive but was still trying to bite the metal gate inside an animal control truck. I heard an officer say the dog had no visible reaction when someone sprayed it with water from a hose to push it back from a doorway. It only turned toward the sound of the stream hitting concrete. That detail bothered me more than it should have. I called Evan again. He said not to build a theory from scanner chatter. He was right. I wrote that down too. It sounds stupid, but when you spend your life collecting reports, you need reminders that facts arrive mixed with guesses. A stressed officer says something strange. A frightened owner remembers a sequence wrong. A clip cuts out the 30 seconds before an attack. If you connect everything too early, you stop seeing what is actually in front of you. At 6:43, a message came through the site's contact form from a woman in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. She'd found my notice through a local pet group. Her father's beagle had bitten him during the night. The dog had started barking at a wall outlet, then at the refrigerator, then at the sound of rain on the gutter. When her father tried to put a leash on it, the dog bit his wrist. The animal was now in a locked bathroom. She wanted to know if anything similar was happening in Minnesota. I did not answer that question directly. I asked about vaccinations, recent travel, wildlife contact, and when the dog had last been normal. The vaccination was current, no known travel, no obvious wildlife bite, normal at dinner, restless around midnight, aggressive after 3. I asked her to call local animal control and a doctor. She replied that animal control had already told her they were dealing with 2 other bite calls. That made 5 dogs if the report was accurate. I opened a blank map and started placing dots. I did not publish it. Minneapolis suburbs, St. Paul warehouse, Eau Claire. Nothing about that map meant anything yet. The distance was too wide for one loose animal, but ordinary rabies cases were scattered by nature. A bat could expose a dog in one county, and another bat could expose a cat somewhere else. Coincidences happen every day. I kept repeating that because the alternative was starting to look organized. At 7:12, Evan sent me a photograph of a yellow legal pad. He had started writing bite cases by hand because the clinic's software was barely working. Their network kept dropping. The first line read, 1:48 in the morning, male cat, owner bitten. The second line was 3:11, dog, veterinary assistant, bitten. The third was 5:59, unknown mixed breed, owner bitten, transferred from another clinic. Then there was a fourth line he had just added. Raccoon, brought in by city worker, found alive beside a storm drain, repeated lunging at sound, euthanized. I called him and asked whether he was testing the animals. He said the proper samples were being sent to the state lab. That would take time. He also said something I did not put on the site. The cat had become weak in the rear legs less than 2 hours after arrival. That fit rabies badly if the owner had been right about the cat being completely normal the evening before. Once neurological symptoms begin, disease can progress quickly, but 4 unrelated animals all crossing that line the same morning would be a hell of a coincidence. Then the airport messages started. A baggage worker I knew from weather closures sent me a note at 7:30. He did not handle passengers. He worked around cargo and service vehicles. He asked if I was tracking animal incidents. I said yes. He told me there had been a problem overnight with a small shipment of live mammals in a cargo area. He would not say what kind. He said 2 workers had been bitten or scratched. One animal was dead. Another had escaped inside a service building and could not be found. Airport management had told staff it was a routine wildlife and cargo issue. I asked which airline. He did not answer. I asked whether the shipment had come from overseas. He replied with a thumbs-up icon, and then deleted the message. That was the point when I stopped treating the morning as a collection of local bite calls. At 7:50, I searched recent veterinary alerts in Canada. Nothing. I searched wildlife rehabilitation boards. Nothing useful. Then I found a short public post from a small clinic outside Winnipeg. It had been up for less than 20 minutes. The clinic was temporarily closed after what it called an animal control incident. Owners with urgent cases were being redirected. No details. I called the number. A receptionist answered and said they could not discuss it. I asked if anyone had been bitten. She hung up. 10 minutes later, the post disappeared. I wrote a draft headline that said multiple clinics report unusual aggressive animal cases across upper Midwest and Manitoba. Then I deleted it. I did not have Manitoba. I had one removed post and a receptionist who hung up. That was not enough. The easiest way to destroy a site built on trust is to be right too early for the wrong reasons. People remember the headline that caused panic. They do not care that you corrected it later. At 8:16, a truck driver called the number listed on my site. His name was Luis Ortega. He hauled live animals for research facilities, zoos, private breeders, and licensed vendors. He talked fast but clearly. He said he was parked outside a fuel stop north of Rochester and had been told not to move his trailer until his dispatcher called back. He had empty transport cages behind him. He wanted to know why 3 veterinary facilities were suddenly refusing to accept animals from his company. I asked what he had carried recently. He said mostly small mammals and birds. Nothing exotic by his standards. Then he mentioned a load from 2 weeks earlier. It had come through a cargo terminal, changed trucks twice, and been rerouted after one receiving facility refused it. Luis had not hauled the first leg. Picked it up later, and delivered part of it in Wisconsin. Another truck carried the rest toward Canada. He remembered because the paperwork had been a mess. The shipment number changed halfway through the route. I asked why. He said he did not know. He said one crate had been removed before he got the load, and somebody had cleaned fluid out of the trailer with disinfectant. He assumed an animal had died in transit. That happened. Not often, but it happened. He did not think about it again until the morning calls started. I asked him to send whatever paperwork he had. He said he would think about it. Then he asked if I thought this was rabies. I told him I did not know. He said, "Good, because everybody else on the internet already knew everything." By 9, my inbox had gone from normal to impossible. Dog bites in Minnesota. A horse in western Wisconsin that had kicked through a stall wall after becoming frantic around a generator. 2 bats found on a loading dock in Ontario. A pet ferret in North Dakota that had bitten its owner and then hidden under a dryer, attacking the metal vent whenever it rattled. Half of the messages were probably ordinary incidents being reinterpreted because people had seen my notice. That is what happens once a pattern enters the public mind. People go back through the morning and attach meaning to everything. The scanner got worse. Officers were being sent to a house where a man had killed his neighbor's dog with a shovel after claiming it was infected. The dog had not bitten anyone. At another address, a woman refused to let paramedics near her husband because she believed they were taking bite victims away for quarantine. None of that was the disease. It was the reaction to the possibility of disease, and it was arriving before any official warning. At 9:28, the state health department posted a brief statement. They were investigating several animal bite incidents in the Twin Cities area. There was no confirmed connection. Residents were advised not to handle wildlife and seek medical care after bites. It was technically responsible. It was also weak enough that people read it as proof of a cover-up. My traffic tripled within 20 minutes. I put up a longer post. I said there were multiple unusual animal behavior reports under investigation. I said there was no evidence of a citywide outbreak and no reason to attack or abandon healthy pets. I explained that rabies in humans normally develops after an incubation period measured in weeks or months, sometimes longer, and that exposure did not mean immediate illness. I told people that anyone bitten by a potentially rabid animal needed professional medical advice quickly because preventive treatment works when given before symptoms begin. I did not name airports. I did not name the Winnipeg clinic. I did not publish Luis's story. At 10:11, Evan called and told me his clinic was locking the front doors. People had started arriving without appointments. Most had no bites. One had been scratched by a vaccinated indoor cat 6 months earlier. Another brought a dead squirrel in a grocery bag. A man had driven in with his family dog tied in the bed of a pickup because the dog barked at him that morning. Evan said the waiting room had turned into an argument. 2 technicians were already at a hospital because of bites. The clinic had 1 security guard, no isolation area built for a crowd, and no way to test every animal people dragged in. He said he was keeping a paper log of every bite-related call because the clinic system was now fully offline. At first he thought the network failure was local. Then somebody from another clinic said theirs was down too because the regional veterinary service portal was being flooded with requests. Evan started reading me times, species, owners, and locations. I opened a spreadsheet and entered them one by one. At 10:34, one line made me stop. A woman from Bloomington had called because her husband had been bitten by a dog at work 3 months earlier while unloading cargo. The dog had been quarantined and later died, but she said nobody ever gave them a clear test result. Her husband had been anxious for 2 days, had barely slept, and that morning had started choking when he tried to drink water. He was at an emergency department. Evan had told her this was a human medical emergency and that a veterinary clinic could not help her. I asked if he had the man's name. Evan said yes, but he would not give it to me. He did give me the workplace category, cargo handling. I stopped and read that line again. The same monitors were on. The same coffee sat cold beside the keyboard. The street outside looked normal. Until that moment, every serious event I had verified was an animal event. A dog, a cat, a bat, a raccoon. Now there was a man who had been bitten months earlier and had a symptom that could appear in rabies once the nervous system was involved. I called the hospital and got nowhere. I called the state health department media number and got a recorded message. I called a physician I knew through a shelter vaccination campaign. She listened, then said she could not discuss a patient even if she knew who I meant. I asked a general question. Could anxiety, insomnia, difficulty swallowing, and fear of drinking happen in rabies? She said yes, among many other symptoms, but that I needed to be very careful because panic could produce some of the same complaints. A terrified person who believed he had rabies could hyperventilate, gag, refuse water, and look neurologically sick without being infected. That distinction mattered through the rest of the next 2 days. At 11, the first video of a sick man hit social media. It was filmed inside an emergency waiting area. He was standing near a vending machine, shouting at staff and backing away from a paper cup. Somebody had added a caption saying, "Rabies patient Minneapolis." The clip showed 20 seconds. In the 20 seconds, he looked aggressive, confused, and terrified. It spread faster than any correction could. I did not post it. I called the person who uploaded it. She said the man had bitten a nurse. I asked if she saw that happen. She said somebody told her. I asked who. She said she did not know. I asked why she wrote rabies. She said everyone there was saying it. Within 15 minutes, I got 6 messages identifying the man. All 6 names were different. At 11:40, Luis sent me 4 photographs of shipping paperwork. The documents were dirty, folded, and partly covered by his thumb. One showed a cargo transfer through Minneapolis-St. Paul. Another showed a veterinary inspection stamp from a freight facility near Toronto. A third had a route code that pointed to Singapore. The fourth had a handwritten correction sending part of the shipment south before it moved north again. Luis said the load had been split several times. He had no idea whether the same animals stayed together throughout the route. I asked what species were on the documents. Mostly bats bred for research, small carnivorous mammals and rodents. Several lines were coded in a way I could not interpret. Luis said live animal shipments often carried paperwork that made perfect sense to the sender and receiver, and very little sense to the driver. Then he told me something stranger. During the Wisconsin leg, one facility refused the shipment because 2 animals were dead, and another was behaving violently. The company told him to hold the trailer while they found a new destination. 4 hours later, the cargo was accepted by another facility under a different receiving number. He had asked whether he needed to sanitize the trailer. The dispatcher said the crates had been sealed and the animals were laboratory controlled. I asked when this happened. He said 3 months earlier. I looked back at Evan's handwritten line about the cargo worker bitten 3 months earlier. Same broad period, same industry. Still not proof, but now the timeline made sense in a way the morning's events had not. If this was some new Lyssa virus, the people becoming sick today did not need to have been bitten today. They could have been exposed weeks or months earlier. The visible outbreak could be the end of a long, quiet chain nobody had recognized. At noon, I changed the headline on my site. I wrote, "Authorities investigate cluster of unusual animal bites in human neurological illness." I hated the second half because I had exactly one possible human case. I added a warning at the top that no new virus had been confirmed and that many reported human symptoms could have other causes. I listed only verified animal incidents and one general note that hospitals were evaluating bite patients. The response was immediate. Some people accused me of hiding the truth. Others accused me of inventing a plague for traffic. One message said I was helping the government move infected people. Another said the city was already spraying something in the storm drains. Somebody sent a picture of a normal mosquito control truck from last summer. The worst part was not the crazy messages. The worst part was the ordinary ones. A mother asking whether to let her son come home from school because a classmate had been bitten by a dog last month. Warehouse supervisor asking whether he should tell 30 employees that 2 bats had been found near their loading area. A man whose brother worked at the airport asking whether he should leave the city before roads closed. None of them needed a theory. They needed a clear answer I did not have. At 12:37, I got one answer. Evan called and said the state lab had flagged one animal sample as presumptive Lyssa virus positive, not standard rabies confirmation. Something was unusual in the test. He was not supposed to know details, and he told me not to use his name. I asked whether the positive animal came from his clinic. He said yes. I asked which one. He said the cat. Then he said they had been instructed to preserve every paper record related to bite cases and to send staff exposure lists through a secure channel. He laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because the secure channel was not working. I asked what he was doing instead. He said, writing everything down. I had one presumptive animal result, a possible human case, an old cargo route, and enough public panic to make every loose dog in the state look dangerous. That was all. I kept the result off the site because presumptive was not confirmed, and because if I wrote cat tests positive for rabies-related virus before the state explained what that meant, people would hear only one word. At 1 in the afternoon, the city animal shelter closed intake. The public notice said the closure was temporary and related to staff safety. 10 minutes later, someone posted a photograph of 2 police cars outside the shelter and wrote that workers were trapped inside with infected animals. That was false. I called a former coworker who still worked there. She said the real problem was simpler. 3 dogs had come in from separate calls. One was normal but terrified. One was injured and snapping because it had been hit by a car. The third had begun biting the metal kennel door whenever people moved through the aisle. They had no safe isolation capacity for more unknown animals. She said the staff had been told to wear face shields and heavy gloves around any animal with unexplained neurological signs. People online saw protective equipment through the windows and decided the shelter was full of monsters. A crowd began gathering outside with phones. One man wanted his dog back immediately because he thought the government was killing pets. His dog had been impounded 2 days earlier for running loose and had nothing to do with the outbreak. At 1:20, police asked people to leave the shelter parking lot. Someone threw a bottle. A patrol car window broke. The first public violence I could verify had nothing to do with an infected person. It was a healthy crowd fighting over what they imagined was happening behind a locked door. The state health department scheduled a briefing for 2. Before it began, an internal-looking document started circulating online. It listed 3 airports: Minneapolis-St. Paul, Toronto Pearson, and Singapore Changi. The document claimed all 3 had been used to move infected research animals. It also listed Darwin, Australia as a secondary receiving point. I stared at it for a long time because the names matched pieces I already had. That made it more dangerous, not more trustworthy. Real leaks often look boring. Bad formatting, missing context, half a page cut off. Fake leaks are built to be believed. This one had enough small errors to worry me. One airport code was written in a way an aviation worker would not normally use. A date format changed halfway down. The footer referenced an agency office that had changed names years earlier. It could have been assembled from public information, and the same rumors already moving through private groups. I sent it to Luis. He said the Minneapolis and Toronto locations were plausible. He had no direct knowledge of Singapore or Darwin. I sent it to my airport contact. He replied that he could not confirm anything, and then told me, very specifically, not to publish the cargo building number shown on the page. That was not confirmation. It was enough to tell me the document had touched something real. At 2, the briefing started online. The state epidemiologist said officials were investigating several animal cases and one human neurological illness with a history of animal exposure. She said there was no evidence of widespread person-to-person transmission. She repeated that ordinary rabies does not spread through casual contact, and that people should not panic around pets. Then she said laboratories were performing additional testing because at least one animal sample showed an atypical result. A reporter asked whether the atypical result was a new strain of rabies. She said it was too early to characterize it. Another asked whether the airport was involved. She said officials were reviewing possible animal movement histories. A third asked how many people might need preventive treatment. She said they did not have a reliable number. That last answer changed the mood online. People can tolerate a lot of uncertainty if they believe someone is counting. When the official answer becomes "we do not know how many," the public starts counting for itself, and public counting is ugly. My site received more than 100 bite reports in the next hour. Most were old. A dog nip from last week, a bat found in a bedroom in June, a raccoon scratch from spring. People who had already been evaluated were calling hospitals again. People who had never sought care were suddenly terrified. Emergency departments were telling some callers to contact public health first. Public health lines were overloaded. Pharmacies were getting calls asking if they stocked rabies vaccine. I called a hospital physician again and asked what would happen if thousands of people suddenly requested post-exposure treatment. She said the system could handle known exposures, but not every person who had touched an animal in the last 6 months. The vaccine supply was not infinite. Rabies immune globulin was even harder to stretch because dosing depended on body weight and the wound situation. She said the worst thing I could do was tell everybody with any animal contact to rush into emergency departments. I put that on the site carefully. I said recent bites, scratches, or direct contact with saliva from a suspicious animal needed medical assessment, but a person who had petted a healthy dog was not in the same category. I wrote that ordinary rabies was not transmitted by being near someone. I added that the disease under investigation had not yet been fully characterized. That sentence mattered. We could not assume every familiar rule would stay familiar. At 3:10, the first report from Singapore reached me through a wildlife veterinarian who had found my site after the briefing clips spread. He did not send names. He sent a description of an incident at a private animal holding facility near the airport several hours earlier, local time. 2 small mammals had developed severe agitation and abnormal responses to light and sound. One handler had been bitten. Another animal had been found dead. Samples were being tested. I asked if he was sure the facility handled international cargo. He said yes. I asked if there was any connection to Minnesota. He said he had heard there might be shared shipping records, but he had not seen them. 20 minutes later, I got a message from Australia. A woman in Darwin said her husband worked around imported animals and had been called in because a holding area was being sealed. She said there had been an animal attack overnight. I could not verify her identity. I could not verify her husband. I could not verify the facility. But for the first time, the places in the circulating airport document began producing independent reports. I still did not publish the list. At 4, the possible human case from Bloomington became 2. Evan's paper log had a call from another family. A 31-year-old man had been bitten by an animal at a cargo facility nearly 4 months earlier. He had received wound care but, according to his family, no complete preventive course because the animal was initially classified as low risk. He developed fever, insomnia, and tingling around the old wound 3 days ago. That afternoon he became confused and struck his brother when the brother tried to help him drink. The timing was not identical to the first man. The symptoms were not identical either. That was realistic, and it made everything harder. Diseases do not read press releases. People do not progress in neat stages. One person has fever first, another has pain, another looks anxious, another looks drunk. If you are waiting for every patient to act the same, you miss the pattern. If you assume every anxious person is part of the pattern, you create one that is not there. At 4:30, a man was beaten outside a grocery store in St. Paul because somebody shouted that he had rabies. I heard the dispatch before I understood what had happened. The man had been yelling and trying to get away from a group near the entrance. He had a bandage on his hand. Someone saw the bandage and thought he had been bitten. 2 people held him down. Another hit him with a metal shopping basket. Police arrived and found that the injury on his hand came from a kitchen knife accident the night before. I posted that incident immediately after confirming it with 2 sources. I wrote the man's diagnosis was not rabies, and that attacking people based on rumors was criminal and dangerous. The post was shared less than the rumor that started the beating. That was when I understood the next problem. Even if the virus stayed limited, the social response would not. Every person acting strangely could become a target. Anybody refusing water because they were scared. Anybody with a bandage. Anybody having a panic attack. Anybody yelling at a hospital. People were learning what they thought the disease looked like from short clips, and most of those clips had no diagnosis attached. At 5:15, my airport contact finally called. He did not use his work phone. He said the cargo problem from overnight involved a shipment that had been flagged because of documentation linked to an older animal transfer. The animals currently in the building were not necessarily infected. That was important. The facility had been closed because officials were tracing a network, not because every cage inside held a sick animal. I asked how far back they were tracing. He said months. I asked whether 3 months was in the range. He said yes. I asked how many workers might have had direct animal contact. He said he could not tell me, then added that the number being discussed internally was much higher than what the public would consider reassuring. I asked whether workers had been contacted. He said they were trying. Some had left the company. Some were contractors. Some had worked one shift and disappeared from the payroll system after changing employers. Some records identified a staffing agency rather than the individual worker. A cargo chain could pass through dozens of hands without one complete list existing in one place. That was the first time the outbreak stopped feeling local to me. Not because of the map, because of the paperwork. An infected animal does not need to cross a city on foot if a company moves it across a continent in 12 hours. A worker does not need to remember a minor scratch if he was told the animal was cleared. Months later, he might live somewhere else, work somewhere else, and walk into a hospital that has no reason to ask about an airport job from last winter. At 6, I had been awake for more than 13 hours, and the day was only beginning to feel dangerous. The first official warning went out to healthcare providers. I got a copy from a nurse who removed patient information before sending it. It asked clinicians to consider rabies-like encephalitis in patients with unexplained agitation, difficulty swallowing, abnormal sensitivity to air movement or water, and a history of mammal exposure. It also told providers to use enhanced precautions around saliva and to report suspected cases immediately. The wording about saliva triggered another wave of panic after someone posted a screenshot. People read enhanced precautions and decided the virus was airborne. It did not say airborne. I wrote that clearly. Then I wrote it again at the top of the page. There was no evidence of airborne spread among the public. The known concern was direct exposure to saliva and bites, with the exact transmission behavior of the new agent still under investigation. A television station called me and asked if I would go live. I said no. They asked if they could quote my site. I said yes if they used the full context. 10 minutes later, a producer called back and asked whether I believed the outbreak came through an airport. I said I believed cargo routes were being investigated. He wanted me to say 3 international airports were the source. I refused. He asked if I had names. I said I did. He asked why I was hiding them. That question followed me for the rest of the story. At 6:40, Luis called again. He had reached one of the drivers who handled the older shipment before him. The driver remembered an animal getting loose inside a transfer trailer near Toronto. A worker was bitten trying to recapture it. The worker finished the shift. Nobody treated the event as a major exposure because the animal's papers said it had been bred in captivity and cleared for transport. I asked whether the driver knew the worker's name. Luis said no. He knew a nickname. That was it. Then Luis said something I did not expect. The shipment had not followed one clean route from Singapore to Toronto to Minnesota. It had bounced. One portion was held in Singapore. Another went through North America. A set of crates was redirected after a receiving laboratory reported a ventilation problem. Some animals were sent south. Some were returned. One leg reached Darwin weeks later under a different shipping reference because the original contract had been split. That explained why 4 distant places could appear connected without one single infected crate traveling neatly through all of them. It also created a bigger problem. If the records had been relabeled, merged, and split, nobody could look at one shipping number and identify every exposure. I asked Luis why live animals would move that much. He said money, delays, contracts, customs, rejected deliveries, weather, equipment failures, quarantine rules, and people making last-minute decisions. He said cargo did not care what story we wanted. Cargo went where somebody could accept it. At 7:10, the state confirmed 2 human patients were under investigation. No diagnosis yet. Both had histories of animal exposure associated with cargo work. One was in critical condition. Officials urged anyone contacted by public health to cooperate and told everyone else not to flood hospitals unless they had a credible exposure or symptoms requiring emergency care. That should have calmed things. It did the opposite. The phrase anyone contacted by public health became proof, in people's minds, that a secret list existed. People started posting names of airport workers, photos, company rosters, LinkedIn pages. A crowdsourced spreadsheet appeared with hundreds of names under the title, Possible Carriers. Some names were employees who worked nowhere near animals. Some had quit years earlier. One man on the list had died in a car crash the previous year. I reported the spreadsheet to the platform and put a warning on my site not to share it. Then somebody added my name to it. That part almost made me laugh. According to the spreadsheet, I had worked at the airport, handled infected bats, been bitten, and was currently hiding in a government hotel. I was sitting in my office in Minneapolis, eating crackers over a keyboard. At 7:35, someone pounded on the front door downstairs. I checked the camera. It was a delivery driver. My heart was going hard enough that I felt stupid when I saw the package in his hand. I had ordered printer paper 2 days before. The normal world was still delivering printer paper, while people online were building lists of suspected carriers. I brought the box inside and locked the door again. At 8, Evan sent me another photograph of the legal pad. He was on page 6. He had changed the way he wrote entries. Time, species, bite location, human exposure, workplace, travel or shipping connection. He had drawn a star beside cases with possible cargo links. There were 11 stars. Several involved pets belonging to people who worked in freight, warehouses, airport services, or animal transport. One dog had bitten its owner 2 months after the owner brought home a carrier crate from work to clean it. Another cat belonged to a warehouse employee who had found a dead bat inside a loading area in May. I called him and said we needed to compare dates. He agreed, but warned me that half the entries were unverified phone reports. We started reading through them anyway. I entered each one into my spreadsheet and marked the source quality. Confirmed clinic visit, owner report, second-hand call, social media only, unknown. Patterns started appearing, then disappearing when we checked them. One neighborhood appeared to have a cluster until we realized 3 reports came from the same Facebook post. One veterinary clinic looked connected until we found that it was simply the only 24-hour clinic in that part of town. A cluster near a warehouse remained after we removed duplicates. So did a cluster tied to 2 animal transport companies. At 9:15, the state lab called Evan directly. I was not on the call, but he phoned me immediately afterward. The cat sample was confirmed to contain a lyssavirus. It was related to rabies virus, but genetically distinct enough that further sequencing was underway. The official announcement would come later. He told me one other animal sample had also tested positive on a broad lyssavirus assay. I asked which one. The raccoon. That made no sense if the problem was only imported research animals. A city raccoon had no cargo paperwork, no employer, no flight history. Evan said exactly what I was thinking. If the raccoon result held, the virus had escaped whatever controlled chain people were imagining. Either local wildlife had been exposed, or the animal had acquired it from some contact nobody understood. I asked where the raccoon had been found. He gave me the general area near an industrial drainage corridor east of St. Paul. I checked the map. It was less than 2 miles from the warehouse where the bats had been found that morning. That did not prove the bats infected the raccoon. It did not prove the raccoon infected anything. But now the local animal cases had a physical geography. At 10, emergency departments across the metro began diverting non-critical patients. One hospital put security at the entrance after a man demanded rabies vaccine for his entire family because a squirrel had crossed their backyard. Another hospital had to separate 2 groups in the waiting room after somebody accused a coughing patient of being infected. Coughing was not even a defining symptom. It did not matter. A nurse sent me an audio message from a break room. She sounded exhausted. She said they had 3 kinds of patients: people with real bites and possible exposure, people with ordinary medical problems who were getting ignored because everyone was focused on rabies, and frightened people with no exposure who were convinced every sensation in their throat meant they were dying. She said one man had not had water for 6 hours because he had read that fear of water was a sign. He was deliberately avoiding drinking so he could test whether the fear appeared. By the time he came in, he was dehydrated and panicking. When a nurse handed him water, he gagged from anxiety. His wife filmed it and sent the clip to relatives. Within an hour, the clip was online labeled "New Rabies Case." I verified that story with another staff member and wrote about it without identifying the man. I said again that fear could imitate pieces of the disease. I said videos were not diagnoses. I said aggressive behavior alone was not proof of infection. It felt repetitive. Repetition was necessary because every hour thousands of new people were joining the story at the worst possible point. At 11, the first confirmed human death was announced, but not in Minnesota. A health authority in Canada reported that a patient with severe encephalitis had died after an illness under investigation for possible lyssavirus infection. The patient had a history of animal handling at a freight facility months earlier. The statement did not name the airport. It did not need to. People found the workplace within minutes. The dead man's family address appeared online before midnight. Police had to send a car to the house because strangers were driving past and filming. That was the point when I took the airport list out of my draft folder and printed it. I wanted it on paper because I needed to look at it away from the screen. Minneapolis, St. Paul. Toronto, Pearson. Singapore, Changi. Darwin. 4 names. If I published them and they were wrong, I could put workers and families in danger across 4 countries. If I kept them quiet and they were right, people with old exposures might miss the connection and fail to seek care. There was no safe choice. Anyone who says there was had never had to decide what unconfirmed information becomes once millions of frightened people see it. I called Luis and asked him one question. If I published the airport names without worker names, would it help people identify real exposures, or would it just start a hunt? He said both. Then he said he wished I had asked him an easier question. A little before midnight, the state released the first laboratory statement. It confirmed that 2 animal samples contained a previously uncharacterized lyssavirus. The wording was careful. The virus was related to known rabies viruses, but officials did not yet know its natural reservoir, geographic origin, incubation range, or whether current preventive treatment would work the same way. They said existing rabies vaccines were expected to offer at least some protection because of the relationship between the viruses, but testing was underway. That sentence about expected protection mattered more than anything else in the statement, and it was still not enough. Within minutes, people online turned expected to offer at least some protection into the vaccine does not work. Others went the opposite direction and said everyone should get vaccinated immediately. Pharmacies that did not even provide rabies vaccination had people waiting outside. I called the physician again. She said nobody could promise exact effectiveness against a new Lissa virus before neutralization testing, but the worst response would be to abandon established post-exposure protocols while waiting for perfect data. She told me that if officials were treating credible exposures, people should follow that guidance. She also said hospitals were already conserving supplies because the number of potential contacts was expanding faster than doses could be moved. I asked how many potential contacts there were. She said she had heard several thousand across multiple jurisdictions, but that number mixed direct exposures with people who merely worked in the same facilities. She made me repeat that distinction back to her before she would say anything else. I put it on the site exactly that way. Thousands potentially requiring review did not mean thousands infected. It did not even mean thousands bitten. It meant thousands of records had to be checked. At 12:30 in the morning, the site slowed to a crawl. Requests were coming from Canada, Australia, Singapore, and Europe. People were translating my posts automatically and sending them back to me, asking whether the translation was correct. I turned off comments because I could not moderate names fast enough. Within 5 minutes, screenshots appeared accusing me of censoring patients. I had not eaten a real meal since the previous night. I heated soup, took 3 bites, and left it on the counter because Luis called with new paperwork. He had convinced another driver to send him photographs from a binder kept in a dispatch office. The pages showed route changes for the same general animal program over nearly 5 months. One entry listed a crate held for inspection in Singapore, another showed a transfer through Toronto, another listed Minneapolis as a temporary hold after a receiving facility in Wisconsin could not accept the shipment. One handwritten note referenced an onward transfer connected to Darwin. The exact airports from the circulating document were now supported by actual transport records, though not all on one shipment and not in one straight line. I asked Luis if I could publish the images. He said no. The documents could identify drivers and companies. He was willing to let me publish the route summary if I removed dates precise enough to identify individual shifts. I told him I needed another independent source. He said I had become difficult in the last 12 hours. I told him that was the only reason I had not already ruined somebody's life. At 1:15, I got that second source from the least dramatic place possible. A retired customs broker in Ontario emailed me a spreadsheet. He had worked on paperwork for animal imports and still had access to archived commercial records through a former client who was trying to understand whether its staff had been exposed. He removed names and account numbers but left dates, transfer points, species categories, and receiving regions. His records matched Luis's route changes within a day or two. Singapore, Toronto, Minneapolis. A later leg associated with Darwin. There were also other places: Los Angeles, Vancouver, Chicago, Frankfurt. Those locations had appeared in the broader logistics chain, but not all had documented animal incidents. That was exactly why publishing a raw airport list was dangerous. A freight route could touch a city without any infectious animal ever leaving a sealed container there. I called the broker. He sounded calm, almost annoyingly calm. He said I needed to separate transit points from exposure points. I asked how. He said by looking for 3 things together: an animal health incident, human handling, and a route record showing the affected group of animals was physically opened, transferred, cleaned, inspected, or held outside sealed transport. I wrote those 3 things on paper and taped them below my monitor. At 2, the first 24-hour mark was still several hours away, and there were already more reports than one person could follow. I stopped trying to read everything. I built filters, confirmed laboratory, confirmed official exposure, first-hand medical, first-hand transport, unverified public report, rumor. I assigned each incoming message one category before I allowed myself to think about what it meant. That saved me almost immediately. A video from Wisconsin showed a man strapped to a hospital bed, screaming and snapping his teeth toward a nurse. The caption said, "Infected truck driver, late stage." It had every visual people now expected: restraints, face shields, panic, aggression. I received it from more than 50 people in 10 minutes. A nurse at that hospital contacted me and said the man was not a truck driver. He'd come in after using methamphetamine and crashing a car. He had no known animal exposure. The video had been taken before the outbreak was even public, then reposted under a new caption. I published the correction with the original frame blurred enough that the man could not be identified. It barely slowed the clip. By dawn, people were still using it as proof that infected patients were filling hospitals. At 2:40, there was a real hospital incident. A suspected Lissa virus patient in Minnesota bit a respiratory therapist during an attempt to clear secretions from his mouth. The worker had protective equipment on, but suffered a bite through a glove near the base of the thumb. I learned about it through 2 healthcare sources and waited until the hospital issued a statement. The patient had not been confirmed yet. The worker received immediate wound care and post-exposure treatment. That incident terrified medical workers more than any video. A person in late neurological disease could be confused, agitated, and unable to control saliva. Even if person-to-person transmission remained rare or non-existent, the exposure risk during care was real. Hospitals began changing procedures: fewer people in rooms, more face protection, security closer to isolation areas. Some staff refused to enter until they were shown written guidance. The public saw those changes through leaked photographs and assumed hospitals knew the virus had become contagious through the air. I spent most of the next hour writing the same sentence in different ways. Protective equipment does not prove airborne spread. A bite risk is enough to justify protection. Saliva near eyes, mouth, or broken skin is a reason for caution. We did not know every rule of the new virus yet. Nobody should turn uncertainty into whichever answer frightened them most. At 3:30, a police dispatcher in a suburb north of the city contacted me privately. She said bite-related calls had changed. Earlier, officers were responding to animals. Now they were responding to people afraid of people. Neighbors reporting someone for acting strange. Families demanding that officers remove relatives who had old bite histories. Store employees calling because a customer would not drink water when offered. One caller wanted police to arrest a man who owned 6 bats legally for educational work. The dispatcher said officers had no special training for any of this. They could not diagnose disease. They could not force every frightened person in quarantine. They were trying to separate actual assaults, medical crises, and rumor-driven confrontations. She said one officer had already pepper-sprayed a man during a panic at a gas station, only to learn the man was diabetic and confused from low blood sugar. I asked if I could quote her anonymously. She said yes, but only if I made one thing clear. Police were not conducting door-to-door rabies checks. That rumor had started after officers visited 2 homes connected to known exposures. I posted it. At 4:12, the airport cargo worker from the first human case died. The state did not announce his name. They confirmed that a patient with compatible encephalitis and a history of animal exposure had died, and that preliminary testing detected the same novel Lissa virus found in the animals. That was the first confirmed human case in the United States. The word novel finally entered the official language. People had been using it all day. Now it was real. The state said the man's likely exposure had occurred months earlier. That one sentence changed public behavior in a way no warning about incubation had managed to do. Everyone began searching backward through their lives. Emergency lines received calls from people bitten by pets last Christmas. Veterinary offices got demands for records from years earlier. Animal shelters had former adopters asking whether dogs that later died had shown neurological symptoms. A woman emailed me because her son had been scratched by a bat while camping the previous summer. Another man asked whether a raccoon that stared at him from a tree in March counted as exposure. I could not answer individual medical questions. I put a permanent notice at the top of the site saying I was not a clinician and could not determine who needed treatment. Then I listed official public health contacts and told people with direct bite, scratch, or saliva exposure to contact professionals. The notice did not stop the messages. At 5, Evan called from his car. His shift had technically ended hours earlier, but he had stayed to help build the exposure log. The clinic had transferred its remaining high-risk animals to a state facility under police escort. He had the legal pads in a sealed document bag because public health wanted copies. I asked how many bite-related entries he had. 116. I asked how many were credible enough to matter. He said maybe 30, maybe 40. He hated giving a number because some were still being checked. Of those, 14 had some cargo, warehouse, transport, or airport connection. 6 animals had died or developed neurological signs. 2 samples were already positive. Others were pending. I asked if he could photograph the pages before handing them over. He said he already had. That paper record became the most reliable early record because the electronic systems were producing garbage, duplicate calls, missing timestamps, cases assigned to the wrong clinic, owners entered under pet names, addresses truncated. One region portal showed a dog bite happening 2 days in the future because a server had changed time zones after an emergency update. Evan's pages were ugly and human, but they preserved sequence. At 5:30, I lined up his entries against transport dates. One cluster jumped out. 3 households with sick animals had connections to workers who had been inside the same cargo building during a 48-hour period nearly 3 months earlier. One worker had brought home a reusable jacket. Another had carried a plastic transport crate to his garage before returning it. A third had been bitten directly by a small mammal and reported it to a supervisor. The direct bite was the cleanest link. The jacket and crate were much weaker. Elicivirus is not normally something you expect to spread efficiently from dry surfaces. I marked those as uncertain. The point was not to force every household into one mechanism. The point was that people with direct animal contact existed inside the same work window. At 6:10, dawn was coming up gray over Minneapolis. Cars were already moving. Coffee shops were opening. School districts were sending messages saying classes would continue, but outdoor animal activities were canceled. Some parents kept children home anyway. Grocery stores were busy, but not empty yet. The city had not collapsed. That made the fear sharper, because every normal routine was happening beside something nobody understood. A man called the site and told me he was standing outside an emergency department with his 12-year-old dog in the back seat. The dog had bitten him that morning. He wanted to know whether to bring the animal inside. I told him not to bring an animal into a human emergency department unless staff specifically instructed him. He said animal control would not answer. The veterinary clinic was closed. He had wrapped a towel around the dog's head because it kept snapping. Talk. I told him to get away from the dog and call emergency services if he could not do so safely. He said he could not leave it alone because someone might walk past the car. I could hear the dog hitting something in the background. Then the line went dead. I never learned what happened to him. That bothered me more than some of the confirmed cases because there was no ending. Just a call, a noise, and silence. At 7:26 hours after the first photograph, federal health officials held a joint briefing with Canadian authorities. They confirmed a novel lyssavirus associated with animal and human cases in both countries. Singapore and Australian health agencies announced parallel investigations into genetically related samples from animals. No one yet used the word pandemic. No one needed to. Officials said the known human cases appeared connected to animal exposure. They said there was still no confirmed person-to-person transmission. They also said the incubation period was uncertain, but that epidemiological evidence suggested some symptomatic patients had been exposed several months earlier. That meant the visible cluster did not represent infections acquired during the last day. A reporter asked the question everybody wanted answered. How many infected people were already walking around without symptoms? The answer was that no one knew. I watched that sentence travel across the internet faster than the rest of the briefing. No one knew. There are situations where uncertainty is the correct scientific answer and the worst possible public answer. This was one of them. At 7:30, my site went down for the first time. I assumed traffic had killed it, but the hosting company said they were seeing a mix of legitimate requests and deliberate flooding. Somebody was hitting the site with automated traffic. They could not tell me who. I switched to a stripped-down emergency page and started reading updates over my small radio setup for local listeners who could not reach the site. I kept the broadcasts plain. Confirmed facts only. No names of patients. No home addresses. No airport list yet. I repeated that healthy pets should not be abandoned. I repeated that anyone with a real bite or saliva exposure should seek professional guidance. I repeated that people acting frightened or aggressive were not automatically infected. The radio messages started bringing in another kind of information. Truckers called from rest areas. Shelter workers called from parking lots. A maintenance worker at a freight facility said managers were destroying old paper labels because they believed the labels contained private customer data. I told him not to steal anything. He said he had already photographed a trash cart full of shipping sleeves. He sent the pictures. Most were useless. Torn barcodes, destination tags, blank plastic sleeves. One photograph showed a handwritten routing correction with a date matching Luis's records. Another had an animal handling warning and a facility code I recognized from the Ontario broker's spreadsheet. I now had enough to say that the logistics chain was real. I still did not have enough to say every airport in the chain was an exposure site. At 8:15, Luis called from Wisconsin. He had ignored his dispatcher's order to return an empty trailer to the yard because he said he did not trust the company not to clean records out of the cab computer. He was parked at a truck stop with printed manifests spread across his passenger seat. He sounded angry now. He told me his company had sent an internal message ordering drivers not to speak to reporters and to direct all government inquiries through management. That was normal legal behavior in a crisis. Luis saw it as proof they were hiding something. I told him those were not the same thing. He got quiet, then said I was probably right. That mattered. Panic was not only happening to strangers online, it was happening to my sources. People who had useful information were starting to interpret every ordinary corporate decision as evidence of conspiracy. I had to verify them harder because they were scared too. At 9, the shortage became public. Several hospitals announced that rabies post-exposure treatment would be prioritized for people with confirmed or high-risk exposures, while additional supply was moved into the region. Officials stressed that this did not mean treatment had run out. It meant they were trying to prevent inappropriate use. People heard rationing. A pharmacy in a northern suburb had its front window broken after employees told a crowd they did not stock the vaccine. A man at another clinic pulled a handgun when staff said they could not vaccinate his family without medical evaluation. Nobody was shot. Police arrested him in the parking lot. The clinic closed for the day. I did not publish the type of weapon or the man's name. Those details did not help anyone understand the outbreak. The important part was that access to preventive treatment had become a public order problem before we had even confirmed how well the new virus responded to that treatment. At 10:20, a county public health worker sent me a partial exposure questionnaire. It asked about bites, scratches, saliva contact, animal handling, cargo work, veterinary work, shelter work, wildlife work, and travel or employment connected to specific facilities. The facility names were redacted, but the number of lines told me there were more sites under investigation than the public knew. I asked her why officials were not releasing the sites. She said because the list was changing by the hour, and because people were already threatening workers. She said one veterinary technician had received messages calling her infected because her clinic treated one positive animal. Another technician's car had been vandalized. Someone had written a warning on the apartment door of an airport employee whose name appeared in the crowdsourced spreadsheet. I asked the question that had been sitting in front of me all night. If a worker from a real exposure site did not know the site was involved, how were they supposed to recognize the risk? She said public health was contacting workers directly. I asked whether they had complete worker lists. She did not answer. That silence was more useful than a denial. At 11, I published the first route map. I did not call it an infection map. I called it a verified animal transport and incident timeline. I included only 3 locations where I had both a documented transport event and an independently confirmed animal health incident involving the relevant chain. Minneapolis, Toronto, Singapore. I left Darwin out because I had a reported incident and route paperwork, but not enough to prove the affected animal group overlapped. I wrote in bold text that transit through a location did not mean exposure. I wrote that the map did not identify infected people. I wrote that the purpose was to help workers and clinicians recognize old animal handling events worth reporting. Within minutes, somebody copied the map, removed every warning, added red circles, and titled it Global Rabies Airports. That version spread farther than mine. I stared at it for a while and thought about taking my map down. Then I realized the false version would remain even if I deleted the source. The information was out. The only thing I could do was keep the accurate version available and update it faster than the people stripping context from it. At noon, 31 hours after the first dog photograph, Evan called with the first result that genuinely scared him. A dog from one of his paper log cases had tested positive for the novel Lissa virus. The dog belonged to a man who had worked at the cargo facility months earlier, but the dog itself had never been near the airport. The owner said the dog had not been bitten by wildlife that he knew of. The owner had been scratched by a transported mammal at work but remained healthy. I asked how the dog could have been infected. Evan said we did not know. Maybe there was an unrecognized wildlife exposure. Maybe the owner brought home contaminated biological material in a way nobody had identified. Maybe the dog's history was incomplete. Maybe the owner forgot a bite. Maybe the dog had contact with a bat nobody saw. I asked whether human-to-animal transmission was possible. He said possible was a useless word without evidence. He was right, and I was doing exactly what I warned everyone else not to do. I was filling a gap with the most alarming mechanism available. At 12:40, the owner of that dog called me himself. He had found my number through the site. He was furious that people were already discussing his neighborhood online. He said his dog had been healthy till the previous evening. He said he had worked cargo for 6 years and had been scratched, bitten, kicked, and shit on by more animals than he could count. He remembered one scratch from the suspect's shipment because the animal had behaved strangely, but he had not considered it serious. I asked whether he had become sick. No. I asked whether he had received post-exposure treatment after the scratch. No. I asked whether public health had contacted him. Yes. That morning, they wanted him evaluated and vaccinated immediately. Then he told me he was not going. He believed the hospital would quarantine him indefinitely. He had read that people on the exposure list were being detained. That rumor was false, but it had reached him before the actual public health worker did. I spent 15 minutes telling him I was not a doctor and could not order him to do anything, but that the disease we were discussing was almost always fatal after symptoms began, and preventive treatment existed specifically for the period before symptoms. I told him the detention story was unsupported. I told him to call the public health worker back. He said he would think about it. I never found out whether he went. That was another thing the outbreak taught me early. Correct information can arrive and still lose. People do not receive facts in order. They receive whatever reaches them first, whatever comes from somebody they already trust, and whatever fits the fear already in their head. By 1 in the afternoon, the second day had settled into a strange routine. Every hour brought one real development and 50 false ones. I stopped reacting to volume. A claim could be shared 2 million times and still be one person lying into a phone. A quiet email from a technician with a photograph of a paper form could change the whole picture. That afternoon, the quiet email came from Darwin. The sender worked in animal quarantine. He gave me enough identifying information that I could verify his employment through older public records, but he asked me not to use his name. He said a holding facility outside the passenger terminal had dealt with a cluster of unexplained mammal deaths nearly 6 weeks earlier. The animals had arrived through a commercial research chain connected indirectly to Singapore. 2 handlers had been scratched. 1 had been bitten deeply through a glove. Nobody was sick at the time. The event was logged as a transport mortality problem. The facility had kept frozen tissue samples because insurance investigators wanted them preserved. After the news from North America and Singapore, those samples were retested. A broad assay had detected a Lissa virus in at least 1 animal. Final sequencing was still pending. I asked why the Australian public statement referred only to a recent animal incident. He said officials were still separating old events from current reports and did not want to imply there had been 6 weeks of known transmission. He sounded defensive saying it. I could understand why. Once the public learns an old sample existed, The next question is why nobody warned anyone. The answer might be that nobody knew there was anything to warn about. That distinction disappears fast during a crisis. I added Darwin to my route timeline, but only after the Australian Health Authority publicly confirmed that archived animal samples were under investigation. I did not publish the handler details. I wrote that the route now involved 4 confirmed investigation points, but that the exact direction of spread remained unknown. That last part mattered, because everyone wanted an origin. Singapore blamed imported animals. North American commentators blamed Asian research facilities. Australian posts blamed North American rerouting. Activists blamed laboratories. Breeders blamed wildlife traders. Wildlife groups blamed commercial breeders. Nobody had sequencing deep enough to prove where the virus started, but blame did not wait for sequencing. At 1:45, a group gathered outside a private animal transport company near the airport. Somebody had posted the company's address with a claim that infected bats were being hidden inside. The company had no animals on site. The building was mostly offices and empty transport equipment. Police blocked the driveway anyway because more cars kept arriving. One man brought a hunting rifle in his truck. He never took it out. Another had a baseball bat. Several people had respirators and goggles. They shouted at employees leaving through a side door and demanded to know who had been bitten. A woman followed one worker's car for several miles while streaming from her phone. I watched the stream long enough to get the license plate of the car doing the following, then sent the information to police and closed the video. There was nothing useful about watching a frightened office worker get hunted down a highway. At 2:15, the federal briefing changed the language around quarantine. Officials said close contacts of confirmed symptomatic patients might be asked to restrict certain activities while exposure assessments were completed. That was not mass quarantine. It was not detention. But by 2:30, rumors said entire apartment buildings were being sealed. One of the supposed sealed buildings was a retirement complex where an ambulance crew had responded to a stroke. Another was a student apartment building with a broken water main. A third actually did have a public health team inside. A resident had worked around suspect animal cargo months earlier and developed fever and severe anxiety. By the time I verified that much, videos showed police in the lobby and residents shouting from balconies. People outside were yelling questions up at them. Somebody threw bottled water toward a third-floor window and laughed when no one picked it up. That detail made me angry enough that I had to walk away from the keyboard for a minute. Hydrophobia had become entertainment. People were testing strangers, offering water, spraying people, filming reactions. A person turning away because he did not want a bottle thrown at him became proof of rabies. I went back on the radio and said it plainly. Do not test people with water. Do not touch them. Do not corner them. Do not use fear as a diagnosis. If someone is having a medical emergency, call for medical help. If someone is attacking people, get away and call police. Do not invent your own test. A few minutes later, a man called and said I was protecting infected people. I asked him what he wanted me to do. He said publish every name. I asked what he would do with the names. He hung up. At 3, Evans Paper Records produced the first clean link between an animal case and a human case that did not depend on cargo paperwork. A woman had called his clinic during the first morning because her terrier attacked her husband. The husband worked maintenance in the same industrial corridor where the positive raccoon had been found. 3 months earlier, he had removed a dead bat from an equipment room using thin work gloves. He remembered one finger getting wet inside the glove, but did not remember a bite. He was healthy. His dog was not. The dog later tested positive. There were several possible explanations, and none were comfortable. The dog could have had its own unnoticed bat exposure. The man could have carried home an infected bat or contaminated material. The two could be unrelated, despite the geography. What mattered was that the local wildlife and household pet cases could no longer be treated as a simple spill from one imported crate. I called a wildlife biologist and asked what would happen if local bats had become infected months earlier. He said we would have a much harder problem, but he would not assume that from one raccoon and a few bat reports. Rabies viruses already exist in bat populations, and testing had to distinguish the novel virus from ordinary strains. He warned me that if I wrote new virus established in local wildlife without solid sequencing, people would start destroying bat colonies. I told him people were already talking about it. He said that was exactly why I needed to be careful. At 3:30, animal shelters across several counties stopped accepting healthy surrendered pets. Owners began leaving dogs tied to fences anyway. Some shelters found carriers with cats inside left in parking lots. One dog was abandoned beside a highway with a note taped to its collar saying Celebdate. It barked at water. That dog was picked up by a rescue worker who later told me it drank from a bowl immediately. By then, ordinary animal behavior was being reinterpreted after the fact. Barking at a sprinkler became hydrophobia. Chasing a flashlight became abnormal light sensitivity. A frightened cat hiding under a bed became neurological decline. Some real cases probably disappeared inside that noise. At 4:20, the state released a number for the first time. More than 800 people in Minnesota were being actively reviewed for possible exposure related to known animal incidents, cargo handling, veterinary contact, household contact with symptomatic patients, or other direct risk. Officials stressed that most would not be classified as infected, and many would not require full treatment. 800 became 800 infected in headlines within minutes. Canada reported several hundred exposure reviews. Singapore did not release a public number. Australian authorities said dozens. Nobody could compare the figures because each country was counting differently. I built a page explaining the difference between exposed, under review, treated, symptomatic, suspected, and confirmed. It was the least exciting thing I published, and one of the most important. People kept using the words as if they meant the same thing. At 5, a county clinic ran out of immune globulin. Not vaccine, immune globulin. That distinction vanished online too. The clinic redirected high-risk patients to hospitals with supply. A crowd formed because people thought the clinic had been hiding doses. 2 men fought in the parking lot over who had arrived first. One had a real dog bite from the previous day. The other had no wound and wanted treatment because he had worked near an airport cargo road. Police separated them. The bitten man lost his place in line because he had to be taken to another facility for a head injury from the fight. I remember thinking that the virus had not touched either of those men as far as anyone knew, but it had already changed the course of their day, their medical care, and probably what they believed about everyone around them. At 5:38, a hospital source sent me the result everyone had been waiting for on the second Minnesota patient. Positive for the novel Lissa virus on preliminary testing. He was alive, intubated, and in critical condition. His family said his known animal exposure had happened more than 3 months earlier. That gave us 2 confirmed human cases in Minnesota, 1 dead and 1 critical, both tied to old animal contact. Canada had 1 confirmed death and another probable case. Singapore was evaluating at least 1 animal handler with neurological symptoms. Australia had not announced a symptomatic human case. Those numbers were still small. The number of people afraid they were next was not. At 6, public health officials finally published a limited list of exposure settings. They did not name individual workers. They named categories and date ranges. Specific cargo buildings in Minneapolis and Toronto, a holding facility connected to Singapore, an animal quarantine facility near Darwin, several veterinary sites, 1 industrial corridor in Minnesota where infected wildlife had been recovered. The list overlapped heavily with what I had. It also contained a date range in Minneapolis that started almost 3 weeks earlier than Luis's oldest paperwork. I called him. He looked through his documents and said there must have been a shipment before the one he knew. He called another driver. That driver remembered moving sealed animal containers from a charter cargo flight more than 4 months earlier. He had no paperwork because his company was subcontracted only for the short local leg. The outbreak chain was older than we thought. That was the moment our understanding of the first 48 hours changed. Until then, we had been tracing backward from visible illness into a few months of cargo movement. Now the official window kept expanding. If symptomatic disease could appear after months and animal transfers had happened over a longer period, Nobody could say the known patients represented the beginning of human disease. They were simply the first recognized patients. At 6:40, I got an email from a man in Nebraska who said his father had died 5 weeks earlier after a rapidly progressive encephalitis. The death had been attributed to an unknown viral cause. His father had worked seasonal freight jobs and spent 2 weeks in Minnesota during spring. The son wanted me to tell him whether his father had died from the new virus. I could not. I asked if tissue samples had been saved. He did not know. I sent him official contact information and told him to ask the hospital whether specimens remained available for testing. Then I sat there looking at his message because it represented the next layer of the outbreak. Old unexplained deaths, old animal illnesses, archived tissue, people reopening grief because a new name had appeared on the news. By 7, laboratories were receiving requests to retest older encephalitis cases. That did not mean dozens of past cases were suddenly part of the outbreak. Most unexplained encephalitis has other causes or remains unresolved for reasons unrelated to this virus. But even a few retrospective positives would push the timeline backward again. At 7:20, the hospital video problem turned violent. A man outside an urgent care clinic filmed a woman stumbling as she walked from a car. He shouted that she was infected. She tried to move past him. He blocked her path and held up a bottle of water, telling her to drink it on camera. Her husband pushed him away. Another person joined the argument. The woman fell. Someone kicked the husband. Clinic staff pulled the couple inside and locked the door. The woman had a severe migraine and had taken medication that made her dizzy. She had no known animal exposure. The person filming posted only the first part, ending before staff explained anything. By the time the clinic released a statement, the clip had already been copied with captions, saying, "Rabies woman attacks crowd." I used the incident on the radio without names. I said there was now verified violence caused by fake diagnosis. I said anyone who confronted strangers to test them was creating exactly the kind of chaos emergency workers could not afford. A caller told me fear was necessary because the government was lying. I asked what specific lie he meant. He said the government claimed only 2 people were infected. I corrected him. Officials had never said only 2 people were infected. They had said 2 human cases were confirmed in Minnesota. The number of people infected but not yet symptomatic was unknown. He paused, then said that was worse. He was right about that part. At 8:39 hours after the first dog photograph, Evan arrived at my office with photocopies of his paper logs. I had not expected him in person. He looked terrible. He had slept for maybe 2 hours. He carried the copies in a grocery bag because every proper document envelope had been used at the clinic. He put them on my desk and told me the originals were with investigators. We went through the pages line by line. The value was not just the cases, it was the order. Before the public knew anything, people had called with certain details naturally. After the news spread, those details changed. Early callers described animals reacting to machinery, doors, lights, engines, and moving water, without knowing anyone considered those details important. Later callers used the words rabid, hydrophobia, light sensitivity, infected. The early reports had less contamination from public expectation. We marked every case reported before the first official briefing. Then we marked those with later laboratory results. 5 of the early animal cases were now confirmed positive for the novel virus. 3 others were pending. 2 had negative standard rabies tests but had not yet been tested with the broader assay. That gave the early descriptions weight. The sound and light reactivity was not just a rumor created online. It had appeared independently before people had a shared story. Evan noticed something else. Several early owners had reported the animals repeatedly trying to enter occupied rooms or follow human voices. That behavior had been interpreted as aggression. In some cases, the animal ignored food and other animals and moved toward people speaking behind doors. I asked whether that meant anything biologically. He said no, not yet. A neurologically disturbed animal might respond to sound for many reasons. We should not turn behavior into evolutionary intent. He was right again. Still, the pattern was disturbing because it made containment harder. A sick animal that hides can be isolated. A sick animal that keeps moving toward noise finds people. At 8:45, Luis sent a photograph of a transport crate from his company yard. He had gone back after management allowed drivers to retrieve personal items. The crate had a faded quarantine sticker and a handwritten code matching one of the older routes. He said the crate had been reused after the suspect's shipment. I asked reused how many times. He said he did not know. Those carriers were cleaned and put back into service. I called the wildlife biologist and asked whether that could explain spread months later. He said ordinary lyssaviruses are fragile outside a host and do not remain infectious indefinitely on dry surfaces. A dirty crate was not a magical reservoir. If contaminated biological material stayed wet briefly, direct contact could matter, but months of surface survival would be extraordinary and unsupported. That killed one of the most attractive theories circulating online. People wanted the crates themselves to be dangerous because crates could be photographed, tracked, and blamed. The more likely danger remained infected animals and direct biological exposure. I published that explanation before the crate image leaked elsewhere. Luis agreed not to post it. At 9:30, federal officials acknowledged that the number of treatment courses requested by states was exceeding normal regional stock levels. Emergency distribution was underway. They also said laboratory studies suggested existing rabies vaccine generated antibodies that recognized the new virus, though the strength and clinical protection were still being assessed. That was cautiously good news, barely registered. The same briefing revealed that investigators were reviewing one healthcare worker who had developed fever and tingling after a bite from a suspected patient. The bite had happened less than 2 days earlier. That timing made rabies specialists immediately skeptical that the new symptoms represented infection from that bite. Even an unusually fast lyssavirus would not be expected to produce neurological disease within a day or two from a hand wound. The worker had also been exhausted, stressed, and recently vaccinated. But the internet had the headline it wanted: First human-to-human case. I called the hospital source. She said the worker had a low fever and anxiety but no neurological signs. Testing was underway. She said several exposed staff members were experiencing headaches, nausea, and panic. They had worked brutal shifts in protective gear, slept poorly, and knew they had been near a fatal disease. Symptoms were real. Their cause was not necessarily the virus. I wrote that as clearly as I could. A new symptom after an exposure is not proof the exposure caused the symptom. Timing matters. Laboratory evidence matters. Clinical assessment matters. I got more angry messages for that post than almost anything else I wrote. People thought caution meant denial. At 10, a rumor spread that the city water supply was infected because rabies patients reacted to water. It was stupid on the surface, but it found a path through people's fear. Stores sold out of bottled water in several neighborhoods. Someone opened a hydrant and filled plastic containers from the street. City officials had to explain that hydrophobia in rabies is caused by painful swallowing spasms and neurological dysfunction, not by contaminated water. I repeated it on the radio. The municipal water system was not the source. Boiling water would not prevent this outbreak. Drinking water would not infect you. A caller asked whether infected people could contaminate public pools with saliva. I told him I could not give individualized exposure advice, but there was no evidence public pools were a transmission route. He asked if I would let my own family swim. I told him that question was irrelevant to the evidence and refused to turn personal behavior into public guidance. He called me a coward and hung up. At 10:35, one of the Minnesota suspected patients tested negative twice for the novel virus. He had been the man from the apartment building with fever and severe anxiety. Doctors found another explanation for his illness. The exact diagnosis was private, but officials confirmed he was not a case. That should have been a major correction, because videos of his building had become proof of secret quarantine. Instead, some people said the negative test was fabricated. I began to understand that a certain part of the audience could no longer be updated. They had built a system where every confirmation proved the outbreak was worse, and every negative result proved the cover-up was deeper. No evidence could reduce the theory. Every new result was being interpreted to support the same belief. I stopped writing for them. I wrote for the worker, trying to remember a bite, the veterinarian deciding whether to close, the nurse trying to explain why one person needed treatment and another needed reassurance, the owner deciding whether to abandon a healthy dog. Those were still reachable. At 11:15, 41 hours in, I received a call from a man who said he had been bitten by a coworker. He worked at a warehouse outside Minneapolis. During an argument over whether to shut down operations, another employee became agitated, shoved him, and bit his forearm hard enough to break skin. The biting employee had no known animal exposure. He had been awake most of the night, was terrified of losing his job, and had been telling coworkers that management was hiding cases. The injured man wanted to know if this counted as human-to-human transmission. I told him transmission had not occurred merely because a bite occurred. A human bite was a potential saliva exposure, and he needed medical evaluation for multiple reasons, including ordinary bacterial infection. Whether the coworker had the novel virus was a separate question. He said police had taken the coworker to a hospital because he was behaving irrationally. I asked if public health had been notified. Yes. I wrote the incident down but did not publish it. There were already enough stories about biting people. Without a diagnosis, it would add panic and no useful information. At midnight, the state announced a third confirmed human case. This one was different. The patient was a veterinary technician who had worked with one of the early infected animals several months earlier. She had documented a bite at the time and received a standard post-exposure series, but investigators were reviewing whether the course had been completed correctly and whether the new virus was fully covered by the vaccine used. Her symptoms had begun before the current outbreak became public. That eliminated the easy explanation of panic. She had fever, pain near the old bite site, insomnia, and increasing difficulty swallowing. She was hospitalized under isolation precautions. The fact that she had received preventive treatment hit people hard. Online posts immediately declared the vaccine useless. Officials said one case could not establish vaccine failure because they still needed records on timing, wound care, immune globulin administration, vaccine schedule, and the patient's immune status. That sounded evasive to people who wanted yes or no. In reality, those details were exactly what determined whether this was true failure. Evan knew the technician. He sat across from me reading the statement and said almost nothing for a minute. Then he pointed out that her bite occurred at another clinic, not his. She had been listed in one of the cross-clinic calls on his paper log because a colleague asked him about an unusually aggressive animal on the same day. That meant his handwritten pages had preserved a reference to her exposure before anyone knew it mattered. We found the line. 3 months and 11 days earlier. Technician bitten during restraint. Animal died next day. Sample status unknown. I called the clinic where it happened. Nobody would talk. 12:40, a former employee did. She said the animal had been a small imported carnivore transferred from a research holding program after a shipping delay. The clinic was asked only to stabilize it. It developed paralysis and died. A standard rabies test at the time had reportedly been negative. Because the result was negative, staff were reassured. I asked whether any tissue remained. She did not know. If the standard test had missed the novel Lissa virus, that could explain why the exposure was not treated with the urgency it deserved. It could also mean other old negative animal samples needed retesting. I sent the information to the state health department and held the story. At 1:15 in the morning, they called me back. A public health official I had never spoken to asked exactly what records I had. I told him I had copies of a veterinarian's paper call log, transport route summaries, and first-hand accounts. He asked me not to publish the old negative test until they verified the laboratory method used. I asked whether they had the original sample. He said they were looking for it. I asked whether other old negative samples were being recovered. He said yes. Then he asked me whether I had an unpublished list of airport workers. I said no. He asked whether anyone had sent me names. I said many people had, and I was not publishing them. He said good. I asked why the government had waited so long to publish facility date ranges. He said because the first internal lists contained hundreds of names and locations that were wrong, duplicated, or based on weak links. If they released them raw, people would treat every person as contagious. He said one internal draft included a janitorial contractor who had never entered the animal area but happened to share a billing code with staff who did. That was the first official explanation for secrecy that I believed completely. It did not make the secrecy harmless. Workers had still missed information they might have needed. But the alternative was not simple transparency. The alternative was releasing dirty data into a frightened population that had already beaten people over bandages. At 1:45, I published a piece explaining exactly that tension without quoting the official. I said incomplete exposure lists could contain false positives, and false positives were not harmless when people were being threatened. I also said delayed disclosure could prevent real contacts from recognizing their risk. Both things could be true at once. The reaction split exactly how I expected. One group said I had become a government mouthpiece. Another said I was encouraging vigilantes by publishing any roots at all. For the first time, I thought both groups had a point. At 2 a.m, 45 hours after the first picture, I finally slept for 18 minutes in my chair. I know it was 18 because the radio log kept running and the next call woke me. A shelter volunteer in St. Paul said somebody had cut through a side fence and opened 2 outdoor runs. The person apparently believed the shelter was hiding infected dogs. One dog stayed in the run. The other escaped into the neighborhood. The escaped dog was not sick. It had been held after its owner was arrested on an unrelated charge. Police and shelter workers spent the next hour searching for it, while residents posted warnings that a rabid animal was loose. By the time the dog was found under a porch, 3 people had called police to report gunshots. Only one report was real. A homeowner had fired into the ground when he saw a dog running across his yard. Nobody was hit. The dog was captured with no injuries. I added the event to my notes under a category I had started calling secondary harm. Not disease, not exposure. Harm caused by what people believed about the disease. The list was getting long. Assaults, abandoned animals, delayed medical care, closed clinics, threatened workers. Police calls, broken windows, a man with a head injury after fighting for preventive treatment, a family refusing to enter a hospital because they believed quarantine rumors. None of those events would appear in a virus sequence, but they were part of the outbreak whether epidemiologists counted them or not. At 2:12, the old animal sample from the bitten veterinary technician's case was found. The clinic had sent brain tissue to a university freezer after the standard rabies test, because the animal's neurological signs remained unexplained. The sample had been retained under a research protocol. Investigators were moving it for urgent testing. Evan looked at me and said that might be the most important piece of luck we had seen. I agreed, but it was not really luck alone. Someone had followed a boring retention policy months earlier. Someone labeled a tube correctly. Someone did not throw it away when the first test was negative. In a crisis, people talk about breakthroughs. Most of the time, the breakthrough is that somebody did the routine work properly before anyone knew it would matter. At 2:24, the federal government issued an emergency order requiring preservation of animal shipping records, veterinary bite reports, laboratory specimens, and employee rosters connected to listed facilities. Companies were warned not to destroy or alter records. That announcement immediately produced claims that companies had already burned evidence. I had one maintenance worker's photographs of discarded shipping sleeves, but nothing showing deliberate evidence destruction. I said so. Some companies probably had deleted ordinary records under normal retention schedules before anyone knew there was an outbreak. That was not the same as destroying evidence after an order. Luis called and said his company had locked drivers out of the electronic dispatch archive. He was convinced they were cleaning it. I told him an access lockdown during a legal investigation could mean the exact opposite. They might be preserving the system so nobody changed anything. He cursed, then said he hated that I kept making his anger less useful. I told him his paperwork was useful enough. At 2:36, a caller from Toronto gave me the first credible account of a patient who may have been exposed by another person rather than an animal, but it was old. Her brother had died almost 2 months earlier, after a severe neurological illness. He had worked in freight and had been bitten by an animal at work months before that. During the last week of his illness, before doctors understood what he had, their mother cared for him at home for 2 days. He was confused, drooling, and difficult to move. At one point, he bit their mother's forearm while she tried to stop him from falling. The mother was now hospitalized with fever, anxiety, pain at the old bite site, and difficulty swallowing. I made her repeat the dates. The bite from her son had happened 7 weeks earlier. That timing was plausible. I asked whether the mother had any animal exposure of her own. The daughter said none that the family knew of. No pets, no wildlife work, no cargo job, no recent bite except the one from her son. I asked whether public health knew. Yes, they had taken samples that evening. I did not publish it. I called the Canadian Health Authority and left a message. Then I sent the details to a physician contact there who had previously answered general questions. She replied only that investigators were reviewing a possible secondary household transmission event and that I should not identify the family. That was enough to keep me awake for the rest of the night. If the mother's sample was positive and her son's archived sample also tested positive, the outbreak would change the known transmission pattern that officials had spent 2 days describing. It would not mean easy casual transmission. It would not mean breathing near someone was dangerous. A bite from a dying neurological patient was an intense saliva exposure. Ordinary rabies has extremely rare documented human-to-human transmission, mostly associated with transplantation, and bites are theoretically capable of transmission even though they are not a common route, because human rabies cases are usually isolated and treated with precautions. But the public would hear person to person and nothing after it. At 2:48, a security guard outside a Minneapolis hospital was injured when a group tried to force its way into an employee entrance. They believed vaccines were being given secretly to hospital staff while the public was turned away. Some hospital employees had in fact received post-exposure treatment because of documented contact with suspected patients. That was not secret stockpiling. It was occupational exposure management. The distinction did not survive the parking lot. 5 people pushed past a barrier. One sprayed a fire extinguisher toward security. Another swung a metal sign stand. The guard went down with a broken wrist. Police arrested 3 people. The hospital locked all entrances except the emergency department and began screening staff badges outside. That change caused another rumor that the hospital had been sealed because everyone inside was infected. I went on radio and explained the actual reason. A crowd had assaulted security. The entrance restriction was a security measure. The hospital was still operating. A woman called me crying because her father was inside for a heart problem and she had seen the rumor. She thought the building was under infectious quarantine. I told her to call the hospital family line and not rely on live streams from the parking lot. That call reminded me there were still thousands of ordinary patients trapped inside the same system. Heart attacks did not stop. Appendicitis did not stop. Pregnancies did not stop. Car crashes did not stop. Every bed filled by a frightened person with no credible exposure was a bed somebody else could need. At 3, officials announced that the old veterinary animal sample was positive for the novel Lissa virus. That confirmed the technician had been bitten by an infected animal months earlier, despite the original standard rabies test being reported negative. Investigators said they were reviewing whether the old test failed because the virus differed enough antigenically, whether the specimen quality had affected the result, or whether there had been another technical issue. That finding was bad, but it solved one mystery. The technician did not represent unexplained vaccine failure after a correctly recognized rabies exposure. She represented an exposure that had been misclassified because the animal itself had not been identified as carrying the new virus. Her treatment record still mattered, but the public narrative that standard prevention had definitely failed was no longer supported. I updated the site, or I tried to. The emergency page returned an access denied message from several networks. At first, I thought the host had failed again. Then messages came from readers saying the domain was resolving to a government notice in some areas and simply timing out in others. My hosting company told me they had received an emergency legal request related to publication of sensitive exposure infrastructure information. They would not explain more over the phone. I asked whether my account had been terminated. They said no. I asked whether the site had been blocked. They said access restrictions had been applied pending review. I knew immediately what had triggered it: the route map. I had published no patient names, no private addresses, and no worker roster. But the map included specific cargo buildings and date ranges now linked to an active investigation. Authorities were dealing with crowds at those facilities. Somebody had decided the public safety risk outweighed the value of keeping the page open. I was furious. Then I looked at the live video of people outside one of the cargo gates demanding employee names, and I could not pretend the decision was simple censorship. I called the public health official who had spoken to me earlier. He answered after several tries. I asked if his agency had blocked the site. He said he could not discuss legal actions. I asked whether anything I had published was factually wrong. He said that was not the only issue. I asked what issue mattered more than accuracy. He said predictability of harm. I hated the phrase because it sounded bureaucratic and because I understood it. I told him workers also needed the information. He said official exposure notices were now public and targeted outreach had expanded. I said their outreach had been incomplete for almost 2 days. He said yes. That stopped me. I expected an argument. He just said yes. Then he told me something off the record that I will leave exactly where it belongs. Officials had spent the first day afraid of panic, and the second day catching up to the cost of not being specific enough. By the time they published clearer facility windows, rumors had already spread before the details were released. I asked whether they had learned anything from that. He said they did not have time to learn it yet. They were still living it. At 3:12, I switched fully to radio. No station name, no dramatic introduction. I just read what I could verify. The new virus was confirmed. The old animal sample was positive. Existing vaccines showed laboratory cross-reactivity, but exact protection was still being studied. High-risk exposed people were being prioritized. Casual contact was not established as a transmission route. People should not confront suspected patients or animal workers. The airport and cargo facility date ranges were now available through official health notices. I did not read addresses over the air. That decision brought people to my building. The first 2 arrived around 3:20. They knocked hard on the downstairs door and shouted that they wanted the list. I checked the camera. 2 men, one holding a phone up at the door, the other had a printed copy of the crowdsourced carrier spreadsheet. I did not answer. They stayed for 10 minutes and left. At 3:28, 4 more people arrived. One was a woman whose brother worked at the airport. She was not threatening. She wanted to know whether his name was on any private list I had seen. I spoke to her through the intercom and told her I did not maintain a list of infected people and could not verify individual exposure status. I gave her the official facility date range and told her her brother should contact occupational health or public health if his work matched it. She started crying and said he would not answer his phone. I could not help with that. The others kept asking for names. I told them there were no names to give. One man shouted that I was protecting murderers. A virus does not turn workers into murderers. I said that over the intercom. He called me a liar. At 3:38, police drove past but did not stop. There were too many calls everywhere. The group outside had not broken anything. They were standing on the sidewalk, which they were allowed to do. I kept broadcasting. At 3:45, Canada called the emergency international briefing. I listened through one ear while reading local messages through the other screen. Canadian officials confirmed that archived tissue from the freight worker who died 2 months earlier had tested positive for the novel Lissa virus. His mother, who had cared for him and had been bitten by him during his neurological illness, had also tested positive on 2 independent assays. Investigators found no known animal exposure for her. Viral sequences from mother and son were nearly identical and fit the timing and epidemiological chain. They called it the first confirmed probable direct human-to-human transmission associated with the outbreak. Even the wording showed how careful they were. Confirmed evidence, probable direct route, associated with the outbreak. They were not saying casual transmission. They were not saying the virus had become respiratory. They were saying a person with symptomatic disease had likely infected another person through a bite. It did not matter. The headline changed everywhere at once. Human to human. The crowd outside my building doubled in less than 20 minutes. Some people had heard the radio. Others came from a live stream. A man in the group was telling viewers that I had the full list of infected airport employees and refused to release it. I had never said that. I had said the opposite repeatedly. I went back on air and described the Canadian case in exact terms. A household caregiver. A bite during advanced neurological illness. 7-week interval. No evidence of transmission through ordinary conversation, shared air, or being in the same room. Investigation ongoing. Then I said the sentence I knew would make people angry. One confirmed bite transmission does not make every exposed person contagious. Someone outside hit the front door with an open hand. The microphone picked it up. I kept talking. At 3:55, the health department released updated guidance for hospitals and households. Symptomatic suspected patients should be managed with strict saliva precautions. People providing direct care should use protective equipment. Anyone bitten by a suspected patient or exposed to saliva through broken skin or mucous membranes needed urgent public health evaluation. Household members without direct saliva exposure were not automatically considered infected. The guidance was practical. It also confirmed that the problem was no longer only animal to human. At 4:05, Luis called one last time. He was on his way home. His company had shut down live animal transport voluntarily, while records were reviewed. He said drivers were being told to preserve route data and report any old bite or scratch, no matter how minor. He had already spoken to public health about one incident he had forgotten until that morning. I asked what incident. 3 months earlier, he had cut his knuckle on a crate latch while cleaning a trailer after an animal transfer. He did not remember saliva or blood getting into it. It was probably nothing. Public health still wanted it documented. He asked me if I thought he was infected. I told him I had no way to know, and that documenting an uncertain exposure was not the same as being diagnosed. He said he knew that. He just wanted to hear somebody say it normally. Then he told me his wife had put his clothes in garbage bags on the porch and asked him not to come inside until public health called back. I did not tell him she was overreacting. She was scared and operating with incomplete information. I told him to follow the instructions he got from health officials and not improvise a home quarantine based on internet posts. He said he would. At 4:15, 47 hours after the first message from the woman behind the laundry room door, the state announced 7 confirmed animal cases in Minnesota linked to the novel Lissa virus, 3 confirmed human cases, and dozens of additional animal and human investigations. Canada had confirmed the retrospective mother and son transmission chain. Singapore had confirmed infected animals and 1 probable human case. Australia had confirmed infected archived animal material and multiple exposed workers under monitoring. Those were the numbers we knew. The numbers we did not know were larger in every direction. How many animals had moved through the route before anyone noticed? How many workers had forgotten scratches? How many old negative samples would turn positive under broader testing? How many people had received adequate preventive treatment? How many frightened people were avoiding hospitals because they thought they would be locked away? How many healthy pets had been abandoned? How many unrelated neurological illnesses were now being treated as suspicious? The crowd outside was close to 30 people by then. Not a mob in the movie sense. No organized uniforms. No coordinated plan. Just ordinary people arriving with different fears and making each other more certain. Some wanted names. Some wanted vaccine locations. Some wanted the airport shut down. Some wanted every animal in the cargo facilities killed. One man kept yelling that anyone bitten should be arrested. A woman argued with him and said her husband had been bitten at work months earlier and was healthy. He told her that proved nothing. She slapped him. He shoved her. 2 other people separated them. I watched through the camera and understood how quickly a group can become dangerous without anyone arriving intending to start violence. I called police again. The dispatcher said units were on the way when available. She told me to stay inside. I told her I planned to. At 4:23, somebody taped a sheet of paper to the front door. The camera could not read it. A few minutes later, another person took it down and held it up to the live stream. It said, "Give us the names." There were no names I could give them that would solve anything. Even the confirmed patients' names would not tell anyone whether they had been exposed. Publishing worker names would not identify infection. Publishing everyone under review would turn hundreds of healthy people into targets. Publishing only people with symptoms would miss the whole point of incubation. The demand sounded simple because fear wants a list, a clean line between safe and dangerous. We did not have one. At 4:31, Evan went back to the clinic. He had been sitting in my office for most of the night, but the hospital system was asking veterinarians to help classify animal exposure histories. Before he left, he took one copy of the paper log and left the other with me. He said not to lose it. I told him the original was already with the state. He said he knew. He still did not want me to lose it. Then he left through the rear stairwell, while the crowd was focused on the front door. At 4:38, the site became completely unreachable, even through the backup address. I received a formal notice by email stating that publication access had been suspended under an emergency order, while authorities reviewed whether certain location-specific information posed an immediate safety risk. I had a process to challenge it. The process would take longer than the outbreak had existed in public. I printed the notice and put it beside the airport list. Then I turned the microphone back on. I said the website was offline. I said I would continue broadcasting verified public information. I said I would not read private names. I said anyone outside my building should leave and use official exposure notices rather than demand information about individuals. The pounding started again. This time it was harder. Someone shouted that I had 2 minutes. I did not know what happened after 2 minutes in his head. I did not ask. At 4:42, with less than 40 minutes left before the full 48-hour mark, federal authorities confirmed the Canadian household event met their working definition for direct human-to-human transmission by bite. They emphasized again that there was no evidence of efficient casual spread. They also confirmed that sequencing from North America, Singapore, and Australia showed a closely related novel Lissa virus, though investigators still could not identify the geographic origin with confidence. That destroyed the last simple version of the story. It was not Minneapolis caused the outbreak. It was not Singapore caused the outbreak. It was not one airport. It was not one company. It was not one bad dog. A network of animal movement had connected distant facilities months before anyone recognized the virus. Some animals got sick and died. Some were tested with methods that did not identify the new agent. Some workers were bitten and kept living normal lives through long incubation periods. Local wildlife may have been exposed around at least one handling corridor. By the time the pattern became visible, the relevant events were already old. That was why the first 48 hours felt so fast, even though the disease itself was not fast. We were not watching a virus infect the world in 2 days. We were watching the world discover what had already happened. At 4:48, a rock hit the downstairs window. The glass cracked but held. People outside backed away from whoever threw it. Nobody seemed to know who had done it. That was almost worse. The group was losing ownership of itself. I kept reading updates. A hospital in Wisconsin asked people with no credible exposure to stop arriving solely for preventive vaccination. A shelter in Minnesota reopened phone intake but not public drop-off. Toronto police warned against publishing addresses of freight workers. Singapore expanded retrospective testing of archived animal samples. Darwin authorities contacted former quarantine employees from the previous 6 months. Federal laboratories began distributing a revised testing protocol to state and provincial labs, so atypical samples would not be missed by narrower assays. Those details were less dramatic than the crowd. They were more important. At 4:54, the woman whose husband worked at the airport came back to the intercom. She had reached him. He had already been contacted by occupational health. His work dates did not overlap the highest risk animal handling window, but they still wanted him to complete a questionnaire. She thanked me. Then she asked if that meant he was safe. I said it meant his known risk was lower than she feared. I would not promise more than that. She accepted the answer and left. That was one of the only moments in those 2 days when uncertainty did not make someone angrier. At 4:58, police finally arrived outside. 2 cars first, then another. Officers told the crowd to move away from the entrance. Most people did. A few argued. One man refused and was detained after trying to push past an officer. Nobody was shot. Nobody stormed the building. The event stayed smaller than what everyone watching online expected. I was relieved by how ordinary the ending of that confrontation was. Instructions, arguments, a detention, people walking back to cars. Fear does not always end in catastrophe. Sometimes enough people decide they do not want to be the first one to cross the line. At 5:03, I received the last important email of the 48 hours from the public health official who had called me earlier. It contained no secret list, no dramatic admission, just a link to an updated official table of verified exposure settings with dates, contact instructions, and risk categories. The table was clearer than anything they had released before. Direct animal handlers in specified windows, veterinary staff involved in certain cases, household caregivers with saliva exposure to confirmed symptomatic patients. People with casual workplace contact were told not to assume exposure. I read the categories over the radio. I did not read names because there still were none. At 5:08, I looked at Evan's paper log again. The first line was a cat, the second was a dog, the third was another dog, then a raccoon, then calls from owners, then old bite histories, then cargo links, then clinics that had closed. The handwriting got worse as the hours passed. Some lines leaned into the margin. Sometimes were corrected. One page had a coffee stain. Another had a fingerprint in dried disinfectant. Nothing about it looked important enough to carry the early history of an international outbreak. But it did. At 5:15 in the morning, almost exactly 48 hours after the first photograph reached me, the National Laboratory issued its formal characterization. Novel lyssavirus, genetically distinct from classical rabies virus, capable of causing fatal encephalitis in mammals and humans. Evidence of prolonged incubation in several human cases. Existing rabies biologics showed meaningful laboratory cross-neutralization, but clinical effectiveness and optimal post-exposure protocols were still under urgent study. Known transmission remained dominated by bites and direct saliva exposure. One retrospective human-to-human transmission by bite was now supported by epidemiology and sequencing. No evidence showed efficient spread through ordinary casual contact. That was the official answer at 48 hours. It was both better and worse than the rumors. There was no instant transformation, no city full of people becoming violent minutes after a bite, no proof that a stranger breathing beside you could infect you, no army of infected people running through streets. The real problem was slower and harder to see. A person could have been bitten months earlier and still feel normal. An animal that died under an old diagnosis might have been part of the chain. A worker might remember a scratch only after seeing a facility date on the news. A clinic might have a frozen sample nobody thought to retest. A family might be frightened enough to hide an exposure. Another family might be frightened enough to accuse a healthy person. And once one direct human bite was confirmed, every argument, every restraint, every confused patient, every healthcare exposure had to be treated with more care than the day before. The police stayed outside my building for another hour. The crowd thinned. My website stayed blocked. The radio kept working. I read the laboratory statement once. Then I read the official exposure guidance. Then I went back through my own notes and corrected 2 times that had changed during the night. I removed one warehouse report that turned out to be unrelated. I added the confirmed Canadian household chain. I marked the Darwin archived sample as confirmed. I left several names blank because that was where they belonged. People kept calling. One wanted to know if he should kill the bats in his attic. I told him not to handle bats himself and to contact wildlife professionals and public health if there had been a possible exposure. One wanted to know if her vaccinated dog was safe after barking at a delivery driver. I told her barking was not a diagnosis. One said his coworker had been bitten at the airport 4 months earlier and was too afraid to call anyone because he thought he would be arrested. I gave him the official contact number and told him exposure was not a crime. Another caller demanded the names again. I told him no. He asked why I cared more about privacy than public safety. I told him because public safety was the reason not to hand an angry crowd a dirty list of unconfirmed people. He said I would be responsible if someone died. Maybe that was the part I could never solve. Every decision had a possible victim attached to it. Publish too early and someone gets attacked. Publish too late and someone misses an exposure. Tell people prevention works and they hear there is nothing to fear. Tell them supply is limited and they rush clinics. Say person-to-person transmission is possible and they avoid their own families. Say it appears to require direct saliva exposure and someone decides a bite is not serious because it happened only once. There was no sentence strong enough to control what happened after people heard it. All I could do was make the sentence true when I said it. That afternoon would bring more cases. The next week would bring retrospective positives, tighter cargo controls, animal quarantines, fights over vaccine allocation, and arguments about how long exposed people should be monitored. Laboratories would learn more about the virus. Some early fears would turn out to be wrong. Others would turn out to be too small. But at the 48-hour mark, none of that was known yet. What we knew was enough. The outbreak had been moving quietly for months, through animals, freight systems, workplaces, and old bite histories. It became visible all at once, because several incubation periods ended close enough together for people to recognize a pattern. The first 2 days were not the start of the disease. They were the start of our awareness of it. And awareness did not make us safe. It made us dangerous in a different way. I turned the microphone off for the first time in hours and heard the building without it. Police radios outside. A truck reversing somewhere down the block. Somebody sweeping broken glass from the sidewalk. My printer feeding out another page because I had forgotten to cancel a job. Normal sounds. The paper beside me had 4 airport names on it. The list that had seemed so important the night before now looked incomplete and crude. Airports were only transfer points. The actual chain was people loading cages, signing forms, cleaning trailers, restraining sick animals, taking old samples, going home, forgetting scratches, getting sick months later, and trying to remember what happened on an ordinary shift nobody had expected to matter. I folded the paper and put it under Evan's copied log. Then the radio started receiving another call. A man said he worked maintenance at a warehouse outside the original investigation zone. He had found 3 dead bats above a loading bay in April. One had been alive when he picked it up with a rag. He remembered a small cut on his thumb that day. He had never reported it because the cut came from sheet metal and the bat never bit him. He sounded healthy. He wanted to know if the warehouse mattered. I asked for the address, the date as closely as he could remember it, whether anyone else handled the bats, and whether he still had any work records from that week. Then I turned the microphone back on.